The corridor of the 20th floor of the Grand Luminary Hotel was a flawless testament to silent luxury. The thick New Zealand wool carpet absorbed the sound of any footstep, and the crystal sconces on the walls cast a soft, golden light, designed to make guests feel they were walking through a dream, isolated from the rest of the world. In that ecosystem of unquestionable wealth, human biology and exhaustion seemed like design flaws that money attempted to conceal. For Naomi Carter, however, that corridor was her tangible reality, the stage for arduous, meticulous labor that kept her anchored in her new life. As a Black immigrant woman, Naomi intimately understood the invisible architecture of that place. She was the silent magic that transformed disheveled suites into immaculate sanctuaries. Her presence was tolerated only if it remained unseen. She had built a wall of ice around her emotions to withstand the disdainful glances, the irrational demands, and the veiled prejudice that permeated the hotel's air conditioning. Her posture was always straight, her uniform impeccably starched, and her resilience silent. She was not there to ask for favors. She was there to build her own destiny through unbending effort. It was this same unshakable dignity that had always bothered Richard Ashford. As a hospitality supervisor, Richard was a man who compensated for his own mediocrity through the tyrannical exercise of small fractions of power. He thrived in a corporate system that historically protected men like him, wielding his authority as an invisible whip to subjugate those he deemed vulnerable. To Richard, immigrant workers were not people. They were disposable cogs, and Naomi, with her quiet competence and refusal to bow beyond strict professionalism, was a direct affront to his ego. That morning, Richard walked down the corridor with heavy, intentional steps. He stopped in front of Naomi's supply cart, his eyes narrowed, searching for any pretext to exert his dominance. "These towels are not folded to the required standard, Naomi." His voice echoed down the hall, heavy with sharpened disdain. "How many times will I have to explain that, in this hotel? We do not tolerate the kind of sloppiness you were likely accustomed to in your country." Naomi stopped arranging the amenity bottles. She took a deep breath, keeping the temperature of her voice at a strictly professional level. "Mr. Ashford, the towels were folded strictly according to the network's standards manual. I can redo them if there is a new directive that hasn't been passed down to me." The absence of fear or submission in her response was the fuel that ignited Richard's insecurity. He didn't want a technical explanation. He wanted blind obedience. He wanted to see her shrink. He took a step forward, invading Naomi's personal space, his face twisted by the anger of someone whose fragile power is questioned. "Do you think you can defy me?" he hissed, his pointed finger almost touching her face. "You are replaceable. One word from me, and your work visa is canceled before you even take the service elevator down. You are nothing here." Naomi kept her gaze locked on his. Her spine was straight. She did not step back, anchored in the certainty of her own worth and the refusal to be diminished by a bully in a suit. "My work speaks for itself, sir," she said, her voice low but as firm as steel. It was this absolute refusal to break that led Richard to cross the point of no return. In a surge of blind fury, driven by the arrogant certainty of impunity, he raised his hand and delivered a violent slap to Naomi's face. The sharp, brutal crack tore through the hotel's tapestry of silence. The sound seemed to reverberate off the silk-lined walls. The impact forced Naomi's face to the side. The initial shock paralyzed the air. Two other housekeepers stepping out of a nearby suite froze in the corridor, their eyes wide, mute witnesses to the public humiliation. Naomi's cheek burned, an instant redness marking her dark skin. But Richard did not stop at physical aggression. The true masterstroke of his brand of cowardice was the manipulation of the narrative. Immediately, he unclipped the two-way radio from his belt. "Security to the 20th floor now," he ordered, his voice suddenly adopting a tone of manufactured urgency and victimization. He looked at Naomi with a cruel, icy smile. Employee Carter has become aggressive and insubordinate. I am terminating her for cause." In the minutes that followed, the machinery of privilege moved with terrifying speed. Security guards arrived, blocking Naomi's path. Richard fired off false accusations loudly, ensuring his version of events was the only one recorded. He weaponized her immigration status as a veiled threat, a reminder of who held control over the system. Naomi did not scream. She did not try to argue against the lie that was solidifying around her. She simply gathered her personal belongings from the cart, her eyes shining with an intensity that Richard mistook for defeat. As she was escorted out of the building through the back doors, treated like a criminal in the place where she poured her daily sweat, Naomi kept her head held high. What Richard Ashford, intoxicated by his own illusion of supremacy, completely ignored was that the woman he had just humiliated and discarded was not a helpless pawn on the board. In the locker room, before handing in her badge, Naomi picked up her cell phone. With fingers still trembling slightly from the adrenaline and the pain, she sent a simple message to a contact saved without a name. She was not just the exemplary housekeeper of that floor. She was engaged to Kim Tamman, the silent, absolute owner of the entire hotel chain. And as Richard celebrated his cruel, petty victory on the 20th floor, he had no idea he had just lit the fuse that would detonate the irreversible ruin of his entire world. High above the sprawling, restless metropolis, in a minimalist office where the air was filtered to absolute purity and the silence was an expensive commodity, Kim Tamman sat behind a desk of reclaimed dark oak. He was a man who had built an empire by mastering the art of invisibility. While his executives craved the spotlight, adorning magazine covers and attending lavish galas, Tamman operated in the deep, architectural shadows of his global hospitality conglomerate. He was the unseen gravity that held the grand luminary chain together, a phantom apex predator who allowed mid-level managers to believe they ruled their own small kingdoms, so long as they generated profit and maintained the illusion of perfection. But Tamman's world was not entirely composed of cold spreadsheets and corporate strategy. His anchor, the single source of genuine warmth in his highly calculated life, was Naomi. She had entered his world with a fierce, quiet independence, refusing to let his immense wealth erase her own agency. She had insisted on keeping her job, on earning her own space in a new country, and he had respected her unyielding dignity enough to step back and let her work within his own flagship hotel without revealing their connection. He loved her precisely because she was a builder, a woman who forged her path with resilience. When the encrypted cell phone resting on his desk vibrated with a single, muted pulse, the delicate equilibrium of his world shattered. Tamman picked up the device. The screen illuminated with a brief, devastating message from Naomi. There were no frantic details, no hysterical pleas for rescue, just the stark, unadorned truth of what had just transpired on the 20th floor. The reaction of a lesser man would have been immediate, explosive rage. Another man might have shattered the glass walls of his office or stormed down to the hotel lobby to physically tear the supervisor apart. But Tamman did not scream. The temperature in the vast office seemed to drop to an absolute zero. His eyes darkened into twin voids of terrifying, calculated focus. The fire of his fury was instantly channeled into the frozen, relentless machinery of his strategic mind. He pressed a single button on his secure console, bypassing the hotel's local management entirely and connecting directly to his global director of cybersecurity. "Lock the localized servers for the flagship property," Tamman instructed, his voice a low, lethal murmur that conveyed a terrifying absolute authority. "Isolate the security feed for the 20th floor from the last 30 minutes. Encrypt it and send the raw, unedited file directly to my private terminal. Do not allow local security or any floor supervisor to access, alter, or delete a single frame." Within 90 seconds, the high-definition video materialized on his monitor. Tamman sat in absolute, sepulchral silence as he watched the digital playback. He watched the argument unfold without audio, reading the aggressive posture of Richard Ashford. He watched as his fiancée, The woman he treated with the utmost reverence stood her ground with impeccable, unshakable grace. And then he watched the slap. Tamman's hand tightened around the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned bone white. The wood groaned under the pressure. He saw the physical impact, the way Naomi's head snapped to the side, and the immediate cruel manipulation that followed as Richard reached for his radio to summon security. The supervisor was not just physically striking a vulnerable woman, he was actively weaponizing the corporate system that Tamman himself had built. Richard intended to bury Naomi under fabricated reports, to use her immigration status as an instrument of terror, confident that the hierarchy would protect a white-collar manager over a black immigrant housekeeper. Richard believed he was utilizing the system flawlessly. What he failed to comprehend was that Tamman was the system. Down in the lower levels of the hotel, inside a cramped, windowless office, Richard Ashford was furiously typing up an incident report. A smug, triumphant smile played on his lips as he fabricated details of insubordination, aggression, and incompetence. He hit the print button, fully believing he had successfully silenced another disposable employee. He felt untouchable, insulated by layers of corporate bureaucracy that had shielded his toxic behavior for years. Back in the penthouse office, Tamman closed the video file. The initial shock had entirely dissolved, replaced by a cold architectural blueprint for absolute ruin. He would not simply fire Richard Ashford. A termination was a mere inconvenience. It allowed the perpetrator to move on, to repeat the cycle elsewhere. No, Tamman decided that the destruction must be structural, public, and inescapable. He would dismantle the man's entire existence, stripping away his reputation, his false authority, and his career, exposing the rotting core of his privilege to the unforgiving light of day. Tamman picked up his phone to summon his elite legal and executive team. The arrogant supervisor had cast a stone into the dark waters, believing it would merely cause a ripple. He had no idea that the resulting wave was already gathering height, transforming into a colossal, silent tsunami that was about to obliterate his entire world. The polished veneer of the Grand Luminary's Human Resources Department was designed to process employee turnover with the sterile efficiency of a machine. Richard Ashford sat across from the senior HR director, sliding his freshly printed incident report across the glass desk with a performative, heavy sigh. He had crafted the narrative with the practiced ease of a man who had manipulated the corporate hierarchy for years. In his written account, Naomi Carter was aggressive, erratic, and dangerously insubordinate, leaving him no choice but to terminate her employment and flag her work visa for immediate review. It is always unfortunate when we have to let go of international staff. Richard lied smoothly, adjusting his silk tie with a look of manufactured regret. But we simply cannot compromise the hotel's elite standards, nor the safety of our guests, for someone who refuses to respect authority. The HR director nodded, stamping the file without a second glance. To the lower-level administration, Richard was a respected supervisor, and Naomi was merely a replaceable name on a spreadsheet. Richard stood up, a smug sense of invincibility warming his chest. He had flexed his power, silenced a woman who dared to look him in the eye, and the system had automatically insulated him. His triumph, however, was destined to last less than 2 hours. As Richard stepped into the executive elevator to return to his floor, his pager vibrated with a sharp, frantic urgency. It was a direct summons to the Apex boardroom on the top floor, a sanctum entirely off-limits to mid-level management unless specifically invited by the regional directors. Richard's pulse quickened with a thrill of arrogance. He assumed his swift, decisive handling of a problematic employee had caught the attention of the higher-ups. Perhaps a promotion was finally on the horizon. When the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom opened, the atmosphere inside instantly suffocated his ambition. The ambient temperature felt as though it had plummeted to freezing. The expansive glass table was surrounded by the highest-ranking executives of the global chain, but none of them were speaking. They sat in rigid, terrified silence, their faces pale, looking less like a board of directors and more like a row of condemned men awaiting the executioner. At the head of the table, bathed in the cold panoramic light of the city skyline, sat Kim Tamman. Richard did not recognize the man's face. Tamman had deliberately remained a ghost in the corporate structure, a phantom owner who operated through holding companies and proxy directors. But the sheer, gravitational pull of Tamman's presence and the absolute deference shown by the terrified executives made it immediately clear that Richard was standing in the presence of the apex predator. "Mr. Ashford," Tamman spoke. His voice was not raised. It was a low, perfectly modulated resonance that carried the devastating weight of an incoming avalanche. "Take a seat." Richard's legs felt suddenly hollow, but he managed to walk to the single empty chair at the opposite end of the long table. He offered a practiced, subservient smile, attempting to mask his sudden, inexplicable dread. "It is an honor, sir. I was just dealing with a minor personnel issue on the 20th. "I am aware of your morning activities," Tamman interrupted, his tone as sharp and smooth as a blade of ice. He did not blink. "You submitted a report claiming a housekeeper was aggressive, incompetent, and dangerous. You utilized company resources to have her escorted off the premises, and you threatened the stability of her immigration status." "Standard protocol for insubordination, sir," Richard stammered, his confidence beginning to crack under the crushing weight of Tamman's dark, unreadable stare. She was completely out of control. Tamman pressed a single button on a sleek remote resting on the table. The automated blinds lowered, plunging the room into shadow, and a massive high-definition screen illuminated the far wall. There was no audio, but the visual evidence was absolute. The raw, unedited security footage from the 20th floor corridor played in pristine clarity. The executives watched in deathly silence as the digital Richard Ashford cornered the housekeeper, invaded her personal space, and, unprovoked, delivered a violent, humiliating slap to her face. The screen then showed the housekeeper, poised, composed, maintaining her quiet dignity even as Richard frantically grabbed his radio to spin his web of lies. The footage paused on the exact frame of the impact. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Richard felt the blood drain completely from his face. The golden armor of his corporate privilege fractured and shattered into dust. "The woman you assaulted," Tamman continued, the lethal calm in his voice finally giving way to a terrifying, suppressed fury. "The woman you attempted to ruin to stroke your own pathetic ego is my fiancée." The revelation struck Richard with the physical force of a derailed train. The air left his lungs. He looked at the phantom owner of the global empire, realizing with absolute horror that he had not just bullied a vulnerable immigrant. He had struck the heart of the man who owned the very ground he walked on. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct," Tamman articulated, his words precise and surgical. "But that is merely the beginning of your ruin, Mr. Ashford. You relied on this corporate hierarchy to hide your cowardice. I have just dismantled it." Tamman stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, radiating the cold, blinding light of absolute power. "That footage has already been securely archived. Within the hour, it will be delivered to our global legal team, the labor oversight boards, and the press. I will personally ensure that your name becomes a toxic liability. You will never manage, direct, or find harbor in this industry or any other ever again." As security personnel entered the boardroom to physically remove the trembling, broken supervisor, Tamman turned his gaze to the window. The slap had echoed in the quiet hallway, but the ensuing shockwave was about to level a much larger system. The strategy had been set into motion, and the reckoning had only just begun. The digital wildfire ignited by the leaked security footage consumed Richard Ashford's carefully constructed life with terrifying velocity. By the following morning, the pristine glass facade of the Grand Luminary Hotel was surrounded by a sea of news vans and reporters. But the true shockwave was not merely the viral video of a single, cruel slap. The exposure had fractured a dam that had held back years of silent suffering, and the floodgates suddenly burst open. Stepping out from the heavy shadows of corporate intimidation, other women began to speak. Former housekeepers, front desk clerks, and restaurant staff, many of them immigrants bound by the fragile threads of work visas, came forward. They shared eerily similar stories of public humiliation, career sabotage, and psychological terror orchestrated by Richard. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident of workplace aggression was rapidly exposed as a deeply entrenched, systemic pattern of abuse. Naomi's stoic resilience had become the undeniable catalyst that finally shattered their collective silence. High above the media storm, inside the impenetrable sanctuary of his penthouse, Kim Tamman orchestrated the fallout with the cold, absolute precision of a warlord. He stood before his panoramic window, his phone pressed to his ear as he issued a series of ruthless, calculated directives to his legal and financial teams. He was not merely satisfied with Richard's termination and public disgrace. Tamman wanted to scorch the earth. He was actively deploying his massive corporate weight to ensure Richard was blacklisted globally, burying him under an avalanche of civil lawsuits, and orchestrating the freezing of his personal assets to guarantee absolute, irreversible financial ruin. Naomi sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, watching the man she loved operate the machinery of destruction. She was entirely safe now, shielded by his immense wealth and influence, but a profound freezing tension was tightening in her chest. The fire of Tamman's vengeance was burning so brightly that it threatened to consume the very foundation of their relationship. When Tamman finally ended his call and turned to her, expecting to see relief or gratitude in her dark eyes, he was met instead with a wall of solid ice. "He will never work again," Tamman stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum of dark triumph. "My legal team is filing a labyrinth of civil claims. By the end of the month, he will be bankrupt, his reputation will be ashes, and his family will lose everything they own. I am dismantling his entire existence." Naomi stood up, her posture as impeccably straight as it had been in the hotel corridor. "And is that justice, Tamman? Or is it simply you proving that you are the larger, more dangerous predator in the room?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. The absolute certainty in his eyes faltered. "He laid his hands on you. He tried to use his pathetic fraction of power to destroy your life because you refused to bow to him. I am showing him what true power looks like." "No," Naomi corrected, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a profound, heartbreaking disappointment. "You are destroying him because he touched what belongs to you. You are acting out of personal possession, not moral justice." She stepped closer, refusing to let the vastness of his wealth silence her truth. "Do you hear the women on the news, Tamman? Do you hear the housekeepers who suffered under him for years? They were abused under your roof, inside the corporate system that you built and ignored because it generated profit. You only unleashed this fire because he targeted your fiancée. If it had been any other immigrant woman in that hallway, Richard Ashford would still have his job today." The silence that flooded the penthouse was deafening. Tamman's jaw clenched. He had believed he was forging an impenetrable shield around her, but he was inadvertently proving that he operated by the exact same rules as Richard, where power was used exclusively to crush those who crossed him. "I cannot be the excuse for your cruelty," Naomi whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes as she reached for her coat. The emotional rupture between them was sudden and vast, a chasm of misunderstood intentions. "I spent my life fighting against men who use their status to annihilate others. I need to know if the man I am going to marry is a builder who wants to change a broken system, or just a king who enjoys burning his enemies to the ground." Before Tamman could formulate a response, the heavy door of the penthouse clicked shut, leaving him standing in the center of his immaculate, empty fortress. For hours, the phantom owner of the global empire remained paralyzed by the echo of her words. On his desk lay the final legal directives that would maliciously bankrupt Richard's extended family, punishing innocent relatives for the supervisor's sins. It was the ultimate, flawless revenge. But as Tamman stared at the documents, the cold, intoxicating grip of vengeance began to dissolve. He realized that power without a moral compass was merely a different form of violence. If he crushed Richard into absolute dust just because he could, he would permanently lose the only woman who saw his soul. With a trembling hand, Tamman picked up his phone and called his lead attorney. He ordered the malicious financial ruin of the extended family to be halted immediately. He would let the civil tribunals handle Richard's individual punishment fairly. The crisis had forced him to make a definitive choice. He laid down his sword of blind revenge, choosing instead to step into the light and face the systemic failures of his own empire. The days following the emotional rupture stretched into a quiet, profound period of reflection. Naomi had retreated to a modest, sunlit apartment far from the soaring glass towers and cold, absolute power of Tamman's corporate empire. In that grounded space, she did not isolate herself. Instead, she became a quiet, magnetic beacon for the other women. Housekeepers, kitchen staff, and immigrant workers gathered in her small living room, drinking warm tea and sharing stories that had been buried under years of corporate intimidation. The violent slap Naomi had endured had broken the seal, but it was her unyielding dignity that gave them the courage to finally step into the light. Meanwhile, the formal labor and civil tribunals convened. The sterile, wood-paneled hearing room felt like a surgical theater where the rotting core of the Grand Luminary's management was placed on public display. Richard Ashford sat at the defendant's table, a drastically diminished figure. His tailored suits seemed to swallow his shrinking frame. The arrogance that had fueled his reign of terror on the 20th floor was entirely extinguished, replaced by the frantic, darting eyes of a man realizing that his systemic armor had been violently stripped away. Kim Tamman sat in the back row of the gallery. For the first time in his reign as the phantom owner of the global chain, he did not hide behind proxies, holding companies or legal shields. He sat in the open, absorbing the full, crushing weight of accountability. As woman after woman took the stand, their voices trembling but resolute, Tamman listened in absolute silence. They spoke of stolen wages, veiled threats regarding their work visas, and the suffocating psychological terror inflicted by Richard. Every word spoken was a mirror held up to Tamman's own empire. Naomi's parting words echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. You only unleashed this fire because he targeted your fiancé. She was absolutely right. He had built a flawless machine for generating wealth, but he had neglected the human foundation it rested upon. He had allowed the ice of indifference to freeze the empathy out of his own corporate structure, creating the very shadows where predators like Richard thrived. When the tribunal reached its conclusion, the verdict was swift and unequivocal. The undeniable security footage and the overwhelming chorus of testimonies left no room for manipulation. Richard Ashford was found liable for severe workplace misconduct, systemic harassment, and abuse of authority. He was permanently barred from holding any management position in the industry, stripped of his professional credentials, and ordered to pay devastating civil restitutions that would effectively bankrupt him. The gavel struck the sounding block, echoing with the finality of a collapsing dynasty. Richard's name became instantly synonymous with corporate disgrace. Yet as the hearing room emptied, the air did not feel triumphant to Tamman. The destruction of one toxic supervisor was a tactical victory, but it did not heal the systemic wounds. He watched Naomi from across the room. She was embracing a weeping former housekeeper, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, protective warmth. She was a natural builder, a woman who instinctively mended what was broken. Tamman walked slowly across the polished floor, stopping a respectful distance away. The freezing, lethal edge that usually defined his presence was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshielded vulnerability. "You were right," Tamman said, his voice low but steady, carrying across the quiet room. Naomi turned to him, her expression guarded but deeply attentive. "I built an empire that prioritized silence over safety. I allowed men like him to operate because I was too detached to look closely at the foundation of my own house. Firing him was merely putting out a single fire, but the structure itself is deeply flawed." He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, bound document, resting it gently on the wooden bench between them. "I spent the last week dismantling the mechanisms that protected him," Tamman continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a transformative, unwavering clarity. "But I also realized that destruction is not enough. I cannot ask you to return to a man who only knows how to ruin his enemies. So I made a choice." Naomi looked down at the document. It was a comprehensive foundational charter. "I am liquidating a significant portion of my personal shares in the holding company," Tamman explained, the architectural blueprint of his new purpose taking shape in the air between them. "I am using those funds to establish an independent, fully funded advocacy center. It will provide free, top-tier legal representation, immigration support, and trauma counseling for vulnerable workers across the entire hospitality industry. It will not be controlled by my corporate board. It will be an autonomous fortress." He took a step closer, leaving the vastness of his wealth behind, to stand simply as a man seeking redemption. "I do not want to be the king of a frozen, silent empire anymore. I want to build a sanctuary. And I want to name it the Naomi Carter Center for Workplace Justice." The moral choice had been irrevocably made. The phantom owner had stepped out of the shadows, surrendering his sword of blind vengeance to lay the first, unshatterable stone of a new legacy. The sterile, wood-paneled atmosphere of the tribunal room seemed to fundamentally alter as the heavy, bound foundational charter rested on the bench between them. Naomi stared at the thick document, her eyes tracing the embossed letters of her own name. For weeks, she had braced herself against the terrifying fire of Tamman's vengeance, fearing that the man she loved was entirely consumed by the intoxicating, destructive machinery of his own power. But the pages resting before her were not a manifesto of ruin. They were an architectural blueprint for salvation. She looked up, searching Tamman's face. The phantom owner of the global empire, the man who could freeze corporate boardrooms with a single darkened glance, stood before her completely unarmored. The cold, lethal edge that had always defined his presence in the business world was entirely absent. In its place was a profound, quiet sincerity that reached across the vast emotional chasm they had endured. "You are relinquishing your shares to fund this," Naomi said, her voice a soft, vibrating hum in the quiet room. It was not a question, but a realization of the monumental sacrifice he was making. He was literally dismantling a piece of his own empire to forge a shield for others. "Power that only serves to insulate the king is a prison, Naomi," Tamman replied, his tone steady and laced with an enduring warmth. "I built a fortress of glass and wealth, but it was hollow. When I saw that footage of you in the hallway, my first instinct was to burn the entire world down to keep you safe. But you taught me that scorched earth yields no harvest. If I want to be a man worthy of standing beside you, I must learn to lay a foundation where others can safely walk." The wall of solid ice that Naomi had maintained around her heart, a necessary defense against both Richard's cruelty and Tamman's terrifying retaliation, finally began to melt. She saw the absolute truth in his eyes. He had not merely bought a charity to appease her, he had fundamentally restructured his understanding of justice. Naomi took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical and emotional distance that had separated them. She reached out, her hand gently resting over his on the thick cover of the charter. The touch was a spark of pure, restorative light, instantly bridging the fractured lines of their relationship. "A center like this cannot be a corporate public relations stunt, Tamman," she whispered, looking deeply into his eyes, setting the terms of their new reality. It must be a sanctuary. It must be a place where a housekeeper holding a fragile work visa can walk through the doors and know that she is untouchable. It needs fearless lawyers, trauma counselors, and advocates who understand that the system was built to silence them. Tamman turned his hand, intertwining his fingers securely with hers. I am merely the architect of the funding, Naomi. You are its soul. I will build the walls, but you will govern the light inside them. I am handing you the absolute authority to lead it. The reconciliation was sealed not with a grand public declaration, but with the quiet, unshakable promise of mutual creation. In the months that followed, the fractured dynamic of the billionaire and the immigrant worker was entirely erased, replaced by an unbreakable partnership of equals. They acquired a spacious, sunlit building in the heart of the city, deliberately far from the intimidating, monolithic skyscrapers of Tamman's corporate headquarters. It was an old masonry structure that they meticulously renovated, transforming cold concrete into warm, welcoming spaces. Tamman often stood in the background amidst the sawdust and scaffolding, watching in quiet awe as Naomi commanded the space. She interviewed aggressive, brilliant labor attorneys, compassionate immigration specialists, and dedicated therapists. She poured the raw, lingering pain of her own public humiliation into the concrete purpose of protecting others. Their evenings, once defined by the quiet isolation of the penthouse, were now filled with blueprints, legal frameworks, and shared visions of the future. The emotional growth between them was staggering. Tamman learned to listen to the silent struggles of the invisible workforce, his empathy thawing the last remnants of his corporate detachment. Naomi, in turn, allowed herself to lean on his unwavering strength, realizing that she no longer had to carry the crushing weight of systemic prejudice alone. Late one evening, just days before the center was scheduled to open, they stood together in the expansive main lobby. The space smelled of fresh paint and polished wood. The warm, golden light from the newly installed fixtures banished every shadow from the room. Tamman wrapped his arms around Naomi from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. You took the ugliest, most violent moment of your career, and you turned it into this, he murmured, his voice thick with profound reverence. Naomi leaned back into his embrace, her hands resting over his. We turned it into this, she corrected softly. You stopped being a weapon, Tamman, and you became my sanctuary. The man who had once ruled from the freezing shadows had finally found his true legacy in the light, completely anchored by the woman who had taught him that the greatest expression of absolute power was the choice to heal the world instead of breaking it. The morning sun washed over the bustling avenue, casting a luminescent golden glow against the brick and glass facade of the newly renovated building. It was a stark, poetic departure from the suffocating, artificial perfection of the grand luminary's 20th floor. There were no heavy wool carpets designed to muffle footsteps, nor were there crystal sconces meant to cast illusions of isolated wealth. Instead, the expansive, open-concept lobby of the Naomi Carter Center for Workplace Justice breathed with natural light, organic warmth, and the vibrant, undeniable pulse of human dignity. The broad pavement outside was not lined with luxury town cars or impatient executives. It was filled with the very people who had spent their entire lives operating in the invisible margins of the city's economy. Housekeepers, kitchen staff, immigrant laborers, and seasoned advocates gathered in a profound, joyful solidarity. They spoke in a beautiful mosaic of languages, their voices rising above the city's hum. For years, the corporate machinery had relied on their absolute silence to maintain its flawless veneer. Today, however, the frost of systemic intimidation had definitively thawed, replaced by the unbreakable warmth of collective empowerment. Standing near the front of the sunlit atrium, Naomi observed the gathering crowd. She was no longer wearing the starched, anonymous uniform of a disposable employee. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored ivory suit, a visual manifestation of her unshakable authority and her emergence from the shadows. The wall of ice she had once meticulously maintained to survive the daily indignities of her labor was gone. In its place was a radiant, grounding empathy, a beacon that drew people toward her. Beside her, Kim Tamman stood as a silent, immovable anchor. The phantom owner who had once governed a global hospitality empire from behind a veil of terrifying detachment was now fully present in the light. He wore a simple charcoal gray suit, his posture relaxed but eternally vigilant. The devastating fire of his immense corporate influence, which he had once nearly unleashed to scorch the earth in the name of blind vengeance, had been entirely transmuted. It now served as the thermal foundation that kept this sanctuary warm and impenetrable. Tamman reached out, his fingers finding Naomi's and intertwining with a quiet, fierce devotion. His touch was no longer a symbol of possession, but a testament to an equal, profound partnership. "Look at what you have built," Tamman murmured, his voice a low, resonant hum that cut through the joyful noise of the room. He looked at the faces of the workers who were finally seeking legal counsel and trauma support without fear of retribution. "You did not just change my heart, Naomi. You rewired the conscience of an entire industry." Naomi squeezed his hand, her dark eyes reflecting the brilliant morning light. "We built it," she corrected gently, a soft smile touching her lips. "Power is only a weapon when it is held by someone who is afraid. You chose to stop being afraid, Tamman. You chose to be a shield." The gentle chime of the microphone signaled the beginning of the inaugural ceremony. Tamman released her hand, taking a respectful, proud step back to allow the woman he loved to command the space she had so rightfully earned. As Naomi walked up to the sleek wooden podium, a profound, reverent hush fell over the hundreds of attendees. She looked out at the sea of faces, women and men who intimately knew the paralyzing fear of a threatened work visa, the sting of public humiliation, and the crushing weight of institutional arrogance. Not long ago, in a hallway designed to muffle the truth, an attempt was made to remind me of my absolute powerlessness. Naomi's voice rang out, clear, steady, and entirely devoid of the bitterness of the past. A hand was raised to enforce a hierarchy of silence. That single, cruel gesture was meant to be the end of my story in this city. She paused, allowing the gravity of that memory to settle, before her expression shifted into one of undeniable, radiant triumph. "But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of our strength," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, briefly anchoring on Tamman's proud, steady eyes. "They believed that because we serve, we are subservient. They believed that without their wealth, we were defenseless. Today, this center stands as the physical, irrefutable proof that they were wrong. When they attempted to bury us in the dark, they merely planted the seeds of a revolution. This building is not just a legal resource. It is a promise. It is a fortress, ensuring that no worker will ever have to trade their dignity for their survival again." The applause that erupted was not merely a polite ovation. It was a thunderous, emotional tidal wave. It was the sound of 1,000 invisible chains shattering at once. Tears streamed down the faces of former housekeepers who, for the first time, felt the absolute certainty of safety. Naomi stepped down from the podium and walked toward the wide, ceremonial ribbon stretched across the main entrance of the legal advocacy wing. Tamman stepped forward to join her. Together, their hands overlapped on the ceremonial scissors. It was the ultimate, symbolic gesture of their reconciliation and their shared legacy, the precision of her lived experience guiding the vast architectural weight of his protection. With a swift, clean cut, the ribbon fell away. The doors were officially open. As the crowd surged forward, filling the hallways with life, purpose, and the beautiful noise of justice, Tamman pulled Naomi into a deep, grounding embrace. The man who had once ruled through fear had found his salvation in the very woman the system had tried to discard. The arrogant supervisor had raised his hand expecting to leave a mark of humiliation. Instead, he had unknowingly forged the unbreakable foundation of a movement. The slap had echoed in a quiet, luxurious corridor, but the devastating, beautiful reckoning it triggered had permanently rewritten the moral horizon of the world.